There is a sound in Morocco that announces itself before you see where it's coming from. Iron castanets clattering in a rolling 3-beat rhythm, a deep 3-stringed bass lute droning underneath, voices calling and answering in a language most Moroccans around them can't fully place. This is Gnawa music, and the people who created it, carry it, and still perform it as a living spiritual practice today are the descendants of enslaved sub-Saharan Africans brought across the Sahara Desert centuries ago. Their history is unusually well documented for a population this specific. What genetics eventually added to that history wasn't a correction or a complication. For once in this series, it was closer to a confirmation, precise enough to feel almost eerie. The historical record here is more detailed than for most populations this channel has covered. Beginning with the Almoravid dynasty in the 11th century and continuing in waves through the 19th, enslaved people were brought north across the Sahara from the Sahelian regions of present-day Mali, Burkina Faso, and Senegal, a trade that intensified sharply after the Moroccan conquest of the Songhai Empire in 1591, when Sultan Ahmad al-Mansur's forces returned from Timbuktu with captives who spoke Bambara, Songhai, and Hausa, languages that, remarkably, still surface in fragments of Gnawa ritual songs today. Major slave markets operated in cities including Marrakesh and Essaouira, feeding a population that Arabic sources referred to by several overlapping terms: Abid or Sudan, meaning slave or black, and two Berber-derived terms, Haratin and Gnawa, that would go on to carry very different social weight in the centuries that followed. Even after converting to Islam, these communities retained pre-Islamic West African spiritual practices, organizing themselves into Sufi brotherhoods built around trance, spirit possession, and healing rituals. With the Ethiopian-born Bilal al-Habashi, the Prophet Muhammad's first muezzin, adopted as their spiritual patron and namesake for related traditions found from Morocco to Libya. Given a history documented this specifically, down to particular ethnic groups, particular cities, and even particular vocabulary surviving in ritual song, you might expect the genetic story to be almost anticlimactic, a straightforward confirmation of details historians had already worked out from written sources. And in one very specific sense, that's exactly what happened, which on this channel counts as a genuine plot twist in its own right. Before we get to the numbers, it's worth pausing on why a clean confirmation would actually be surprising here. Most of the populations this channel investigates involve DNA either recovering a history nobody had bothered to document or complicating a history everyone assumed was settled. Morocco's sub-Saharan descended communities present neither situation. The written record is unusually rich already. The interesting question isn't whether history was right, it's whether genetics could actually measure something that specific and land on the same answer independently. A 2023 genomic study analyzing trans-Saharan migration into North African populations applied newly developed methods to date the sub-Saharan derived segments found in Moroccan and Tunisian genomes, and found that the timing of this admixture overlapped closely with the peak centuries of the documented trans-Saharan slave trade, the same 11th through 19th century window the historical record already described. This is a rarer outcome than it might sound. Across most of the populations this series has covered, genetic dating has either pushed founding events earlier than expected, later than expected, or revealed a completely different timeline than oral tradition claimed. Here, the genome and the archive landed on essentially the same era, independently, using completely different kinds of evidence. Here's a question worth sitting with, though, before this starts to sound too tidy. If the timing checks out this precisely, why does the broader story of African ancestry in Morocco still feel so invisible in how the country talks about itself? The answer lies in a number that looks almost contradictory next to everything just described. The Moroccan Genome Project, sequencing genomes representative of the national population, found an average West African ancestry component of only about 7% nationally, That's a strikingly low figure for a country whose most visible African-descended communities have such a well-documented, historically specific founding story. The explanation is that this 7% is a national average, blending Morocco's Amazigh and Arab majority populations, who carry very little of this ancestry, together with Gnawa, Haratin, and other historically enslaved or African-descended communities who carry substantially more. A national number this low doesn't mean the Gnawa story is small. It means the label Moroccan is being asked to average together populations with dramatically different genetic histories into one figure that ends up representing almost nobody specifically. If a gap like that, between a national statistic and the specific community actually driving it, makes you want to dig into other countries where an average number might be quietly flattening a much sharper story underneath. That's exactly the instinct this channel runs on. So go ahead and subscribe, because we keep finding this same pattern in country after country, and there's another one coming up you won't want to miss. And if you've ever looked at a national ancestry statistic and wondered which specific community was actually driving that number, tell us in the comments, because that question alone has become one of the most reliable ways this series finds its next subject. It's worth adding a comparative note here, because it sharpens exactly how unusual this case is next to everything else this series has covered. When researchers dated the Cape Verdean admixture event, they landed on a documented 1,460 founding, another rare case of genetics matching the archive closely. When they dated the timing of blending in Pakistan's Shidi population, they found a 300-year window that helped explain a genetic outcome nobody expected. Morocco's case sits closer to Cape Verde than to Pakistan in this respect. The dating exercise here wasn't solving a mystery so much as double-checking an answer historians were already fairly confident about, and getting the same result back. That kind of quiet agreement between two completely independent lines of evidence, written history and population genetics, developed centuries apart and using entirely different methods, is its own small piece of scientific reassurance, even when it doesn't produce a dramatic reveal. This is where the term Haratin deserves honest treatment, rather than a simple definition, because scholars genuinely disagree about what it describes. One school of thought treats Haratin populations concentrated historically in the oasis communities of southern Morocco and the wider Sahara, as descendants of the same trans-Saharan slave trade that produced Gnawa communities in the cities, sharing substantially overlapping ancestry and history. A second, competing scholarly position argues that at least some Haratin communities represent something different, indigenous, dark-skinned Saharan oasis populations whose presence in the region predates the slave trade considerably, who were nonetheless assigned a slave-descended social status based largely on skin color rather than documented ancestry, a racialized label applied regardless of actual genetic history. Genetic studies specifically isolating Haratin populations from the broader trans-Saharan sample remain limited, which means this particular question, unlike the Gnawa slave trade timing itself, is one this channel can't currently resolve with a clean genetic answer. Both readings currently coexist in the scholarship, and pretending otherwise would overstate what the data actually shows. It's worth dwelling for a moment on how specific the surviving cultural evidence actually is, because it rarely gets this granular in populations shaped by forced migration centuries ago. Ethnomusicologists working with Gnawa communities have documented ritual songs, the Malouk repertoire performed during the all-night Leela ceremonies, that retain vocabulary identifiable as Bambara and Hausa, even though almost none of the performers today speak either language fluently or understand the words as anything beyond sacred sound. The songs are organized around a structured pantheon of spirits, each associated with a specific color, scent, and rhythm, a cosmological system anthropologists trace directly to West African spirit possession traditions rather than to anything indigenous to North Africa or imported through Islam. This is, in effect, a second independent archive running alongside the written historical record and the genetic data, a body of preserved performance practice that has been transmitting specific checkable details about West African origin for centuries, without any of the participants necessarily framing it as historical preservation at all. When the different lines of evidence, oral, genetic, and archival, all point toward the same 11th through 19th century window and the same general West African source region, that convergence is happening across three genuinely independent methods of reconstructing the past, which is rarer than it might sound and worth treating as its own small piece of evidence. For Gnawa communities today, particularly in Marrakesh and the coastal city of Essaouira, this layered history exists alongside a genuinely successful modern cultural revival. For much of the 20th century, following independence in 1956, Gnawa culture sat outside the version of Moroccan national identity the new state was constructing, associated too closely with slavery and sub-Saharan Africa to fit comfortably into an Arab Amazi nationalist narrative. That began shifting in the 1970s, when the popular Moroccan band Nas El Ghiwane incorporated Gnawa rhythms and instrumentation into mainstream music, introducing the tradition to a national audience that had largely overlooked it. Today, the annual Gnawa World Music Festival in Essaouira draws hundreds of thousands of visitors and has become one of Morocco's most significant cultural exports, a striking reversal for a tradition that spent decades treated as a marginal remnant of a history the country preferred not to examine too closely. UNESCO added Gnawa cultural space and practices to its representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity in 2019, a formal international recognition that arrived roughly 9 centuries after the trade that first brought Gnawa ancestors north across the Sahara, and only a few decades after the tradition began receiving serious attention inside Morocco itself. What makes the Gnawa case valuable to this series isn't a surprising percentage or an overturned assumption. It's the reminder that genetic confirmation and social visibility don't automatically move together. The trans-Saharan slave trade's timing shows up in the genome exactly where the archives said it would. The communities descended from it can name their ancestral ethnic groups, their patron saint, even fragments of the languages their ancestors spoke, preserved intact in ritual song for centuries. And still, a national ancestry statistic can average all of that into a number small enough to make the entire story look statistically negligible unless you already know exactly where to look for it. The archive was right. The genome agreed. And the national statistics still managed to make the whole story disappear inside an average, which may be the most honest lesson this particular episode has to offer. Being correct and being visible turn out to be two entirely different achievements, and a population can win the first without ever quite securing the second.